out.
Say their name, say Chambers are looking for you, hey, they gone, they running, they be scared. You know? They will kill you in a minute with no hesitation.
In many places, the crack trade has transformed small-time hoodlums into big-time entrepreneurs. Among the most remarkable examples is the notorious Chambers Brothers gang of Detroit.
If you've ever seen New Jack City, then you would know that some of the characters were actually based on real-life gangsters who ran the streets of Detroit, the Chambers Brothers.
In many places, the crack trade has transformed small-time hoodlums into big-time entrepreneurs. Among the most remarkable examples is the notorious Chambers Brothers gang of Detroit.
In the movie, Wesley Snipes played Nino Brown, a ruthless drug kingpin who, along with his crew, the Cash Money Brothers, took over Harlem's crack trade.
This is the fruit of our hard work, the belief in the entrepreneurial spirit.
He got so big that he turned an entire apartment complex, the Carter, into his own personal drug empire. But here's the real kicker. While Nino ruled Harlem on screen, the real-life version of his operation wasn't in New York. It was happening in Detroit, and the man behind it, B.J. Chambers, one of the infamous Chambers brothers.
This is my very first crack house, 1261 Newport. It was like in 1984, the early part of 1984 when everything started.
These guys weren't just some small-time hustlers. They ran one of the biggest crack operations in the 80s, raking in millions and making national headlines. They started off selling weed just to get by, but once they got into crack, everything changed. Fast. The crack era brought chaos to the streets. Police were scrambling to keep up, and the Chambers Brothers became a name that struck fear across Detroit. Their empire got so big that even Bill Clinton name-dropped them in his presidential nomination speech. But trust, their story runs way deeper and far more realistic than it was portrayed in New Jack City. Let's get into it. The Chambers Brothers weren't just another group of gangsters. They were something way more ruthless, way more calculated, the kind of guys who didn't just play the game. They ran it. With sharp minds and zero hesitation, they took over Detroit's drug scene like a storm, leaving nothing but wreckage in their path. Even the old-school gangsters, the ones who'd been running the streets for decades, wanted nothing to do with crack. Too unpredictable, too reckless. But the Chambers Brothers, they thrived in that chaos. They were the new kings of the underworld, and even the most hardened criminals had to admit these guys were terrifying. You've probably heard plenty of rags to riches stories, but nothing quite like this. These weren't just hustlers. They were empire builders, stacking up cash at a rate no legit business in Detroit could dream of. Try wrapping your head around $250 million a year. Yeah, that's the kind of money they were pulling in at their peak. But before all that, before the mansions and luxury cars, they came from nothing. Dirt poor, stuck in the backwoods of Arkansas, growing up in a world that gave them nothing and expected them to stay that way. Born into a family barely scraping by as sharecroppers in tiny nowhere town Marianna, Arkansas, the Chambers Brothers knew struggle from day one. 16 people crammed into a tiny cabin, fighting for every meal, every inch of space. Poverty wasn't some temporary setback. It was the way things were. And it wasn't just about being poor. Racism was as much a part of life as the air they breathed, in a town where Confederate ghosts still whispered through the streets.
It was a real hotbed. Racism was a real hotbed. Even at one time, one of my brothers was walking up the road. I'm in a little small town called Lee Grange, Arkansas. A white guy and his friend was riding a motorcycle, actually deliberately ran over my brother. And nothing was dead. But that was the type of stuff that we could expect.
Being black meant being at the bottom, and if violence or injustice came knocking, there was no one coming to help. But the Chambers Brothers weren't built to be victims. They figured out early that the world wasn't going to hand them anything, so they started taking. From picking pockets at the family's juke joint to hustling grown men at the pool table while standing on crates, they learned fast that rules were for suckers. Their parents, Curtis and Hazel, had already laid the groundwork, running that juke joint with equal parts grit and hustle.
Had a club down there that was
correct.
What did they call it? A club or juke joint? What did they call it?
A juke joint, cafe. He built it with scrap.
Mm.
He built it actually with scrap, you know, and when he opened it up, man, it was a success.
Showing their sons firsthand that survival meant knowing how to play the game. And when their parents split and the business folded, most would have seen it as the end. For the Chambers Brothers, it was just the beginning. Larry, Wiley, BJ, and Otis, 4 names that would become legend. Larry, the eldest, was the enforcer, the one who never backed down, whose very presence sent people running. Wiley, the one who had once walked the straight path as an army man and postal worker, found himself pulled into the underworld.
26, Otis 20, Willie 34, and the ringleader, Larry 38, were recently convicted of operating a crack empire.
BJ, smooth as silk, could talk his way into or out of anything. And Otis, the youngest, wild and unpredictable, always ready to prove himself. They weren't the biggest guys, but in the streets they were giants, commanding fear, demanding respect, unstoppable in their rise to power. They moved like shadows, untouchable, their empire growing with every move they made. And in a city where power was everything, the Chambers brothers weren't just players. They were the ones calling the shots. Of all the Chambers brothers, Larry was the only one who had real trouble with the law before they got into the drug game.
Well, Willie was kind of known as the one that was kind of getting in trouble, in and out of jail. Like,
that was Larry. That was my oldest brother.
Okay,
they called
Larry.
Marlowe.
The third eldest, sometimes called Marlowe, wasn't just another street hustler. He was smart, tested with an IQ over 140. But a regular 9-to-5? That was never in the cards for him. He wasn't built for the grind of normal life. He craved the thrill, the adrenaline rush of bending the rules and living on the edge. While his brothers at least tried their hand at legit jobs before diving into the drug trade, Larry knew from the start, being a crook was the only path he ever wanted to walk.
It was just like, I'm done. I'm not going in this field no more, chopping no cotton for nobody. You know what I'm saying now? And just took off. You know, he took off. By him not having a game plan, just looking at his criminal record, he was doing a lot of break-ins at that time to survive.
One Christmas Eve, Larry's luck ran out, landing him behind bars after a robbery gone sideways. But sitting in a cell wasn't his style. He pulled off a daring escape on New Year's Eve only to be caught again after a string of armed heists. That reckless streak earned him a 40-year sentence. But if prison was supposed to break him, no one told Larry. He didn't just sit back and do his time. He escaped multiple times, slipping through the cracks again and again, until, finally, his luck ran dry. Even when the system hit him with heavy sentences, he never let it change him. Every time he got out, he picked up right where he left off. More robberies, more run-ins with the law, never slowing down. Then, something unexpected happened. His conviction got overturned by the state Supreme Court, and suddenly Larry had a shot at a fresh start. He went back home, tried to do things the right way. But some habits are impossible to shake. Before long, he was back to robbing jewelry stores, riding that same reckless wave until he was finally caught in Detroit, this time betrayed by an old partner. Locked up again, Larry changed. The wild card, the untamed outlaw, he let it go. Instead of running on impulse, he found discipline. He took up yoga and meditation, swapped chaos for control, and became something else entirely, a leader, an example to the inmates around him. The same mind that once plotted escapes and heists was now focused on something deeper, something bigger. Meanwhile, Billy Joe Chambers and his brothers were looking for a way out of their old life. Farming wasn't cutting it, so Billy Joe took his shot, heading north to Detroit, chasing a future that promised something better.
I eventually ran away.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I eventually ran away at the age of 15 to the young lady house that I had met in Detroit, man.
No one could have predicted how that move would change everything.
You never really been around drugs?
No.
Things of that nature. So how did you get introduced to the drug game?
Well, the young lady that I had came and stayed with, her moms and their family was into drugs.
When did it click for you to start doing this for Buddy?
It really didn't click for me, man. A buddy made it click for me. A friend of mine did. We was both from Arkansas. Weed.
Gotcha.
And like I say, we was lames. We didn't know anything about the drug game or whatever because when I used to go over his house, his brother had garbage bags of weeds on the wall.
Yeah.
It never registered to me that, hey, they really selling this shit. He said, what's up? I said, man, we're trying to get some smoke. He said, some smoke? What do you mean? Some weed. I said, what y'all trying to do with weed? He said, man, we're trying to sell some. He said, hold on for a minute. Let me go out to the car. Went out to the car, man, came back with a pound. And he owed us a quarter of a pound off. We like, damn, what we owe you for this right here? He said, give me $25. We like, we ain't got no money. Just give it to me whenever you get it. And that's where it all started from right there.
They didn't come to be criminals, said Dr. Carl Taylor. They came looking for work, hoping to make a real life for themselves. But when that dream started slipping away, when they realized the system wasn't going to make room for them, things turned dark, fast, Detroit welcomed Billy Joe, and for a moment things looked promising. He got into the marijuana trade, made money, started tasting success. But once that hunger sets in, once you see how easy the cash flows in the right game, it's hard to stop. And Billy Joe wasn't about to settle. Not when something even bigger was waiting around the corner. Billy Joe wasn't exactly eager to jump into the crack business, but when he saw how fast the money was flowing, it was impossible to ignore. Crack wasn't just a drug, it was a gold mine. And the Chambers brothers knew how to make the most of it. What made them different was that they weren't part of Detroit's usual crime circles. They were outsiders, just some country boys from Arkansas who nobody took seriously at first. The local hustlers dismissed them as nobodies, but that didn't last long. Before anyone realized what was happening, the Chambers brothers had muscled their way in, built an empire, and forced the streets to recognize them as a real force. With the help of a family friend, Billy Joe and his brothers made their move.
Like, man, I don't know why I can't get this shit off the ground, man. And he told me what he'd been doing. He said, yeah, he was, and he was telling me about it. And I was like, I'm good, dog. He's like, no, but you think you good. You think you rich. I was like, no, I don't think I'm rich, man, but I'm doing good. He's like, man, you need to see the money that you can make off this and sell it for me. If you would let them come over here, blah, 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 and give me the money one more time, which an ounce, I think, was $2,800. I was on the phone. And I was like, ask him, what do he want? He's like, he can't tell you on the phone. He needs you to come back over there. Just tell me, man, I'm gonna believe. He said, about $30,000 worth of customers just came over here. I said, man, get the out of here. He said, I told you weren't gonna believe it. Just like that. I said, you serious? He said, man, the police was out here directing traffic.
And it didn't take long for them to become the name in the game. Their crack operation spread like wildfire, fueled by ruthless business tactics and a steady flow of product. BJ, always the businessman, turned a car wash and a store into his own personal drug empire, pushing weed and crack out of both spots. His supplier, Big Terry Colbert, kept the goods coming, and a tight crew of family and trusted friends helped him run the show. But the real secret to their success? They had an army. Word spread fast. And soon, young men and women from Arkansas were flooding into Detroit, ready to work for the Chambers gang. DEA reports estimated over 300 people from their hometown and surrounding areas made the move, looking to cash in on the booming drug trade. The Chambers brothers had built something massive, something unstoppable. BJ wasn't the biggest guy, barely 5'5", but what he lacked in size, he made up for with an iron will and business instincts sharper than most Wall Street execs. Once he got rolling, there was no stopping him.
This is my very first crack house, 1261 Newport. It was like in 1984, the early part of 1984 when everything started.
The empire he and his brothers built became the biggest crack distribution case in U.S. history. Between 1983 and 1988, they ran 300 crack houses and pulled in up to $250K a day.
Well, we had got to a point where we was making at least $250,000 per day, every day.
Damn.
Every day.
And they didn't just run their business like street dealers, they operated like a full-fledged corporation. They had strict rules for their workers, a structured operation,
Rules, the 10 crack commandments, how you'll get fined for certain acts that my brother considered would be a violation.
And even marketing strategies, offering 2-for-1 deals and discount coupons for crack rocks. They controlled the trade in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods, making millions while pulling in wave after wave of young recruits looking for an easy payday. But while the Chambers brothers were getting richer, the people buying from them were being destroyed, caught in a cycle of addiction and violence that would leave a permanent mark on the city. By the spring of 1986, tragedy struck. Their brother Little Joe passed away, and his funeral in Arkansas was nothing short of extravagant, a send-off only drug money could buy. Fueled by grief and a drive to make their empire even bigger, the brothers returned to Detroit with fresh recruits and even bigger ambitions. But their success had put a target on their backs, and the feds were watching. What ultimately brought them down wasn't just police work. It was their own arrogance. Larry's ex, Patricia Middleton, turned informant, feeding the cops insider information that led to massive raids. But the real mistake, Larry and his right-hand man, Jack Frost Jackson, filmed themselves flaunting their riches, counting stacks of cash, showing off their jewelry, living like kings.
Throw these ones away, man, since we got $500,000.
Well, I'll tell you what we can do. We can give it to the poor.
They thought they were untouchable, But those home videos would become the evidence that sealed their fate. By 1992, the hammer came down. BJ and Otis were arrested. Willie was taken in while still wearing his postal worker uniform. Larry, already in custody, was named the main defendant. When police raided their properties, they seized $1 million in cash and jewelry, 68 cars, and 250 weapons. On top of that, they confiscated 41 luxury vehicles and another $500,000 in cash and jewelry. At the time, Detroit Police Chief William Hart called it a major victory in the war on drugs. But in a twist of fate, Hart himself was later busted for embezzling $2 million from police funds and sentenced to 10 years behind bars. In October 1988, the Chambers brothers and 10 of their associates stood trial for conspiracy and tax evasion. Witnesses testified about their brutality. Stories of enforcers pushing people out of windows or mangling their hands if they sampled the product. Some informants were silenced, but it didn't matter. Their empire was already crumbling. Then, another blow. David, the oldest brother, died from AIDS complications in 1987. By December, federal indictments were unsealed. Larry was arrested, and the Chambers brothers' reign over Detroit was officially over. Despite all the flash, the cash, and the larger-than-life lifestyle, all four Chambers brothers eventually landed in prison, proving that no empire, no matter how big, how bold, or how untouchable it seems, can last forever. Larry and BJ took the worst hit, slapped with the infamous kingpin charge for running one of the biggest drug operations around. Larry got life, BJ was staring down 50 years, Willie got 21, and Otis ended up with 27. Willie finally walked free in 2007 after doing about 19 years. But BJ caught a rare stroke of luck. His kingpin charge got tossed in 91, chopping his sentence down to 27 years instead. He ended up serving 23 and walked out of prison in July 2010 at 48 years old, stepping into a world that had long moved on without him. By then, the empire was nothing more than a ghost of what it once was. The money, the power, the fear they once commanded, it had all evaporated, leaving behind empty streets, crumbling buildings, and memories that felt more like a dream than reality. The legend was still alive, sure, but the kingdom itself was long gone.
He went on his own, but he found a spot over on Drexel, and the spot was doing pretty good. And but he had started smoking, and so he wanted me to buy the spot out for him. So, since he was a friend of mine.
Now, only Larry remains behind bars, deep into his 60s, a relic of an era that burned fast and bright. Meanwhile, Willie, BJ, and Otis are out, each carrying the weight of their past, trying to carve out something resembling a future. Their story, rising from nothing to ruling the streets only to watch it all collapse, became the kind of tale people still whisper about, even earning a feature on American Gangster. It's the ultimate warning. Power is intoxicating, ambition is dangerous, and no matter how high you climb, the fall is always waiting. And speaking of crime stories, the Chambers brothers saga didn't just shake up Detroit. Many of you already know that it helped inspire New Jack City. Barry Michael Cooper, the journalist turned Hollywood screenwriter, was one of the first to document the crack explosion of the 80s. That first-hand knowledge shaped the gritty realism of New Jack City, with Wesley Snipes playing the ruthless kingpin not so different from the real-life drug lords he had studied. Cooper didn't stop there. He went on to write Sugar Hill, 1994, another crime drama starring Snipes, and Above the Rim, 1994, a basketball drama with Tupac Shakur in a streetwise dealer role. Together, these films became known as his Harlem Trilogy, setting the stage for a wave of 90s black cinema that pulled back the curtain on gang life and the drug trade. What made Cooper's work so powerful was his unique blend of literary depth and raw street authenticity. He could reference Hemingway and Dostoevsky in one breath and then perfectly capture the slang and status symbols of the streets in the next. As critic and filmmaker Nelson George once put it, Cooper wasn't just telling crime stories, he was translating an entire world for the big screen. Barry Michael Cooper didn't just write about the streets, he captured their pulse, their energy, their highs, and their brutal lows. He painted a world where young hustlers dripped in gold chains, stuffed their pockets with wads of cash, and chased fast money, even if it meant leaving a trail of destruction behind. He wasn't just documenting crime, he was telling the story of a new era, one where the American dream had a darker, deadlier price tag. I wanted to detail their voices, the way the hustlers talked, Cooper once said, comparing his work to The Great Gatsby, his mission, to take Harlem's legacy and reframe it in the modern world. And he did just that. In the mid-'80s, his in-depth reporting on the crack epidemic shook up the journalism world, with pieces like Kids K and Kids exposing the rise of teenage drug dealers making thousands a day, living large with beepers, cell phones, and designer shopping sprees. His writing wasn't just sharp, it was groundbreaking. He even gave the world the term New Jack, flipping it from street slang into a cultural movement. That article didn't just make waves, it opened Hollywood's doors. Just weeks after Kids K and Kids hit the Village Voice, Cooper was flying first class to meet Quincy Jones. Soon he was reworking a script about Harlem drug lord Nicky Barnes, shifting the story to the crack era and creating the unforgettable Nino Brown in New Jack City. That film, and the Harlem trilogy that followed, cemented Cooper as one of the most influential voices in black cinema. Barry Michael Cooper passed away on January 21st in Baltimore at the age of 66, leaving behind a legacy that stretched far beyond journalism or Hollywood. He was a storyteller who saw the streets for what they were: glamorous, violent, heartbreaking, and made sure the world saw them too. His words, his vision, and his impact will live on, forever shaping how we understand the rise and fall of an empire built on crack coke.